In this next part of the class, we're going to start focusing on how to perceive, understand, and represent space in our drawings. There are various ways that we can understand and perceive space. These can also be used as a way to create a believable sense of space within our drawings. These include overlap, change in size, atmospheric perspective, isometric perspective, and ultimately linear perspective. In this video, we will talk about how to use these in our drawings. Ultimately, what we are going to be doing is trying to understand how space exists and how to represent that three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional picture plane. The most basic way of starting to understand space is on a two-dimensional surface. If you represent one object overlapping another, we cannot help but understand that one is in front of the other. And this is the most basic way to create space. However, it tends to still be a very shallow space. We can enhance this perception by the way we use colors and the way we use the emphasis of light and dark. But what we're going to also be wanting to understand is how the change in those things creates space as well. Another way we perceive space, which is often either not perceived or just kind of neglected, is the idea of atmospheric perspective. This is when objects that are closer are more dominant and distinct with a higher contrast, more detail, and the further into the distance things get, the more they become obscured by the atmosphere. This is much like how we perceive things on a cloudy day. And what we can do is learn how to use this to our advantage in drawings. Another way we perceive space is by seeing objects that would relatively be the same size. As they get further away from us, they tend to get smaller. And we can enhance this by using atmosphere and linear perspective as well. And we'll be talking more about that in a little bit. One very intuitive way of representing space is going to be what's called linear perspective. And this is a traditional way that many art forms have used the representation of space. Basically, it's the idea that things that are closer are down low in the perspective, and things that are higher in the picture plane are actually perceived to be further away. Oftentimes, this is reinforced by the overlapping that is occurring in the image as well. One thing that's interesting is this is a way to easily represent three-dimensional space in a two-dimensional way. This is part of the reason why in so many games we see isometric perspective as the way to represent space, because basically you're using a two-dimensional algorithm to describe a three-dimensional perception of space. And in the next little bit, I'll show you how that is created. Isometric perspective is created by using three different lines on an XY grid. And when those lines are used to construct objects or interiors or spaces, we actually perceive a three-dimensionality to it, even though it's a purely two-dimensional representation. I do not expect you all to use this, but hopefully it'll help us understand how perspective works and how it can be represented, and how we then can take that to the next level in our drawings. Artwork had remained basically very two-dimensional with some isometric perspective for many millennia. But during the Renaissance, artists started to push the boundaries of our perception and representation of space. And part of that was the understanding and started the creation of linear perspective. Although there's some debate on who actually invented linear perspective, I don't believe it was actually an invention as much as a development. I think over time, artists slowly began to realize that you could represent space in this way. However, Brunelleschi was the first one who really maximized its effect in his own artwork. For us to use linear perspective, we simply have to understand the basic elements of a drawing that we have already discussed, but we're going to expand on how to use them. The most basic is the idea of a horizon line. And what you do is decide on a vanishing point and realize that any line that is moving away from you converges toward that point. And then the simple way to represent objects is to understand that anything that's setting flat on a surface is horizontal to the top and bottom of the picture plane, and anything that's standing vertically is horizontal to the sides. Our basic objective in this class is to learn how to understand the way that objects exist in space and how to represent those in the most believable and convincing way possible. By using linear perspective, we can create this space and then learn how to use other methods to develop all the other aspects that create a convincing drawing by populating that space, texturing that space, and giving light and shadow to that space. What I want you to realize in this class is that all of us have the ultimate ability to draw as well as the old masters. It simply takes a dedication to understanding the process, understanding the methods, and ultimately just having the dedication and desire to work to that level. Do not be intimidated by the drawings that we may see in this class, but challenge yourself to be a peer of these artists. So what you're going to do for your assignment is you're going to take as large a sheet of paper as you want, not too small, but you don't have to overcommit on a giant one. And I want you to find a space, an interior space that could be your dorm room, hallway, or be creative. Go up to the library. You can find some interesting places to draw there, or even go into the student union building. You can find places to just sit down and take your time and draw an interior. Now, what I want you to do is draw from the same type of observation that we've been doing. I want you to look at everything and try to get the natural feel of it, but we're going to use linear perspective as a way to kind of help us again find these little methods of measuring things to make sure that it's as believable as possible. This image gives you a good idea of how the rule of the ellipse plays into the use of vanishing point in linear perspective. Obviously, you have to get that curve the right way, but I find that drawing a sort of rectangular space and then curving it always helps to make it work out easier. So what I want you to do is try to be as creative as possible with the space that you find. There are a lot of interesting places on campus. Obviously, some may not be very accessible. You might have to check with the front office of a building and just let them know what you're doing so they can have somebody clean after you're done. But try to find a place that you find interesting. But it has to be an interior, and it has to be using only 1 point perspective. Now, if any of you happen to go to your house, I find a lot of interesting things to draw inside of homes. I used to be, pretty prolific with sitting around and drawing my own house because I'd just be looking for something to work on. But if you do this, try to be as precise as possible. Try to really capture the feel of that environment, and even try to maybe get a little bit of an emotional expression in what you're doing. The other thing I want you to do is draw lightly in your preliminary sketching. Don't overcommit to the lines, because I want you to do the same thing as we did on the last drawing. Go back either in a pen or a solid line of pencil, graphite, and just redefine every line in a precise way, kind of like what these are. And if you want to go back on this drawing and erase any design lines that are showing through, that's fine, because on this one I really want to see the end result of your linear perspective. And as you're drawing, I want you to try to be as precise as possible. Don't worry about shading, but do try to activate surfaces and add any details that you can. There will be a portion on the grading of this that's going to be, a matter of how much detail did you work in. And I'm not considering that as necessarily shading or value, but if you want to give texture to surfaces just to make it interesting, by all means do that. But whatever you do, just try to think of setting the highest aesthetic standard as possible. And we'll just see how they turn out. If you have any questions, ask. But this is going to be the only drawing for this week. When we do this drawing in class, I give you 2 entire class days to work on it. So I expect this to be a very substantial drawing, probably the most substantial we've done yet. So you'll have to dedicate time, find your way of working, and don't feel like you have to do it all at once. Work on a little bit and then take a break. And also realize that the more precise you are with your technique, the better it's going to look. What I would really like to see you do even is possibly outline things that are closer with a little heavier line. So if you're using a pen, maybe use a heavier line on the things that are close and then a very light line. If you have a set of pens where you have different widths, this is a good chance to use those. But however you interpret is going to be up to you. Do try to think of the way that all these types of perspective are existing in the space that you're observing, but definitely, prioritize making all of the linear perspective in your drawing be as accurate as possible.